Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and I'm very excited about this panel discussion that we're hosting here on MBR. This is one of the few spaces in the podcast world, the Mormon podcast world, in which we can bring together people with different viewpoints, different worldviews, and have civil discussions. And so it was brought to me about hosting this after these gentlemen were guests on a previous episode about did the early Mormon church use psychedelics in their worship services. Now, this is controversial, but this is also something that a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of scholars think that the early first century Christian churches may have been spiking the wine as well. So this is not something that just comes out of a vacuum. The idea that maybe psychedelics have been used in religious practices is not actually a foreign idea. As a matter of fact, it's actually historically hard to disconnect the two from each other. And so it makes for a very fascinating hypothesis. But before we get started, I just wanted to share with everybody. Here we go. Share this real quick, just as a reminder. Okay, so of course, you all know Mormon Book Reviews. That's my YouTube channel. We're doing really well, really excited. But many of you probably aren't aware of the new channel that recently got started called the Utah Interfaith Forum. This was birthed out of a Facebook group by the same name. And my new co-host, Monica, and I have been in the process of taping interviews with a variety of people in the interfaith space in the state of Utah. Some of these conversations I think were really important, and really it's about having a civil dialogue that converges in the state of Utah, whether we have Muslims, Jews, atheists, all these different people with different worldviews, and having interfaith dialogue and conversations, which I think is really important in these very tumultuous and divisive times. So without further ado, I want to welcome my panelists. All of you have been on my program before. Alex, Bryce, Cody, you guys are the guys with this really interesting hypothesis. Welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having us again.
Yeah, we're very excited about today.
Great. And then, of course, Brian Hales is, of course, I would say I'm friends with all of you. And Brian, I've known you probably the longest, probably from my first Mormon History Association in June of 2021. And I want to just welcome you back to the program. Brian, how are you doing today? Turn your microphone on first. Let's do that. There we go. That happens. There we go.
Sorry, I can't see that. Yes, thank you, Steve, for having me on. I'll try to keep my microphone not muted when it's my turn to speak. So
yes. So basically, what happened was Brian is responding to the work that these gentlemen have done, and what we've agreed to do is that Brian is going to be giving like a three-part section, basically a slide presentation where he's kind of pushing back on this hypothesis. What we're going to do is Brian, during each section, is going to give his presentation, and then when he's done with it, these gentlemen are going to be able to have a conversation about what he had just presented. Now, I reserved them the right that if they felt like they needed a point of clarification, or they had a question or something like that, or wanted to push back a little bit on something, they do have the right to come in and do that, just in case they need to. But they will have the opportunity to respond to everything that Brian is talking about, or what they feel is important to respond to. So let's get started, Brian. Why don't you just start with and before we get started, Alex and Bryce and Cody, any questions or anything before we get started, or any clarifications we want to say here? Or okay, so
I would actually like to do a disclaimer. We are going to be discussing entheogens and psychedelics throughout this, and many of these substances are illicit substances. So the purpose of our appearance here is just for the sake of information and to inform people on what this is about. We do not condone the use of illicit substances, and we encourage people to do further research for themselves and to begin to understand the world of psychedelia.
Thank you, Bryce, for bringing that up. And this is an educational endeavor. And so let's all come and learn together. So Brian, why don't you get us started here? And let's have a fruitful conversation today.
okay, this topic is fascinating to me, and it was introduced to me through this 2019 article that was published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, and both Cody and Bryce were co-authors on that, and Alex has expressed the same kind of interest and support. And when it came out, I was asked by Interpreter to respond to it, and I read through it. I honestly wasn't that impressed, so I declined, but they came back and asked me to respond. And I ended up writing this very long article that was published by Interpreter, and I've reviewed it recently, and I really think that it's too long, and that I could have done a more concise job about dealing with the concerns about the validity of the hypothesis. And my number one concern, and I've shared this with Bryce and Alex and Cody in an email, was that the hypothesis in question in this article really does not approach the topic using scientific method. And the article itself has some real problems. I think it needed a good content editor, copy editor. Anyway, we don't have to go through those problems. There's a lot of information there, but to me, it just kind of rambles, and it isn't well organized. It certainly isn't systematized, as most of the scientific articles are that I'm familiar with. I'm, as an anesthesiologist, practicing for over 35 years. I've read hundreds, if not thousands, of scientific papers, and they all basically follow what we call the scientific method. And this is to allow people to stay on the same page throughout the discussion. And it also leads us to conclusions, I think, in the most methodic way. And it begins by making a question or an observation. And in this case, I think the question is, what caused the visions of Joseph Smith and the early Latter-day Saints? And then the next step is that we do some research on the topic. And so I'd like to just introduce that part of it now. What would we research? Well, what we could do is we would notice that there are a lot of different chemical substances out there, some of which are called psychedelics. And we notice right off the bat that some of these can cause hallucinations. And the idea is, well, maybe these religious visions are really just people hallucinating because they've taken some of these psychedelic chemicals. And so that's part of the theory. So we observe that as a possibility. And then we also notice that if we look at these, that magic mushrooms, the psychedelic drugs, even maybe peyote, could have been available to Joseph Smith. And so we wonder, did he actually partake of these? And was this part of the process of creating these visionary experiences? And this is what is advocated throughout the article that I showed. These are called entheogens, and that's a new word, relatively new word. And it's a title or a label for chemicals that can cause ostensibly a religious experience in the people who take them. Now, the other part of researching at this stage of the scientific method is to look at the type of visionary experiences that the early Latter-day Saints reported. Joseph Smith, there's this article by Alex Baugh, a dear friend of mine, who found 76 accounts of Joseph Smith's visionary experiences. He's having a lot of these. He's telling people about a lot of visionary experiences. He also dictated some lengthy revelations. He also dictated the very long Book of Mormon. And the article makes this statement that Smith used a seer stone to translate, and we hypothesize an entheogen. So this is part of the hypothesis in the article. And just one fun fact, my current research is all about the Book of Mormon and its origin. But this is important for the theory that he may have been taking entheogens as he's dictating for the 3 months. The word stream contains 207 named individuals who are mentioned 3,780 times with 2 possible mistakes. This is the Mosiah Benjamin switches. There's 149 promised land locations that are referred to 670 times with 2 apparent errors. There's armies marching to the wrong cities in Alma. And then there's 44 social geographic groups that are like Lamanites and Nephites that are mentioned 1,674 times with no mistakes. These numbers show that through over 6,000 recall events, during the 3-month dictation, Joseph Smith remembered the names of more than 400 people, places, and groups with over 99% accuracy. So if we're going to theorize that Joseph is taking an entheogen, it's going to be one that's going to help his memory. And I would argue there is no such drug, but because if there were, you should market it on college campuses today. And give me some too. As I'm getting older, I would love to have some of this. But these are the kinds of facts that we want to understand as we start to hypothesize what's going on here. Now, that's not all. And this is a big point of the article. And Fawn Brody said it very well. She said at an early age, Joseph Smith had what only the most gifted revivalist preachers could boast of: the talent for making men see visions. And then she also said Oliver Cowdery, who was a Book of Mormon scribe and one of the 3 witnesses, had seen visions that were more real to him than meat and drink. And what I wanted to also do at this point is here is an account of the Kirtland Temple dedication. And it's by Benjamin Brown. It was written down hours or days after it occurred. He's an eyewitness. So this is a really reliable account, about as reliable as we could hope for. But it also illustrates a number of the different types of visionary experiences that are being described by the Latter-day Saints and Joseph Smith. And I'm sorry, I want to read it. I don't have a lot of long readings here, but this is the longest one. But it illustrates what we're talking about, that entheogens are supposed to have caused. And Benjamin Brown said this. He said, "Brethren began to prophesy. Many prophesied in the name of the Lord, then began speaking in tongues, and it filled, as it were, the whole house. Perhaps there were 40 speaking at once. Cloven tongues of fire was seen to sit on many of them, and hand was seen laid upon one when he spake in tongues to the Lamanites. Many visions seen. One saw a pillow, that might be pillar, or a cloud rest down upon the house, bright as when the sun shines on a cloud like as gold. Two others saw 3 personages hovering in the room with bright keys in their hands." So a group hallucination, and also a bright chain in their hands. The west end of the house was illuminated by a light from heaven, seen on the outside by many. Father Stephen saw 2 rows of angels through the house. So if we just highlight a few of these, there's prophecies, there's speaking in tongues, there's seeing clouds, there's group hallucinations, if you will, or visions. There's multiple references to light, brightness, fire, and sun. So if we throw the net a little wider, the visionary experiences of the early Latter-day Saints had a beginning and an ending. There's full immediate recall. And this is a really important point when it comes to some of the entheogens. These aren't people who are saying, "Oh, you know, I had a vision, but I can't remember what it was." And then a few weeks later, they remember one piece and then another piece. These people are recalling these right after the account. Nobody's reporting amnesia. A few of the reports of people being weak afterwards, but there are no reports of hours-long intoxication with incoherence or a general unresponsiveness. They're interpreted by the people who receive them as divine, as coming from God, and they increase the faith in their specific religious beliefs. They're speaking in tongues, but it's described as actual genuine foreign language, and I've actually experienced this on my mission. It doesn't sound like just somebody babbling or somebody with slurred speech. There's coherent prophesying pertinent to their situations. There's reports of conversations with spiritual beings who delivered meaningful messages. There's many reports of light and brightness, and there's group experiences. And then a few things that the visionary experiences are not. There's no grotesque or outlandish distortions of people or objects. There's no reports of persistent intense anxiety, fear of losing yourself or your sanity, desires to harm yourself or others. There's no reports of visionary experiences increasing in intensity to the point of death. There's no reports of nausea or altered bodily functions. There's no reports of darkness. None are ever attributed to surreptitiously administered substances. And I've studied this. There's no cause and effect sequences related to previous sacrament administration. And so now what we've done is, I would say, we've kind of researched the topic area. We've looked at what entheogens are, what they can do generally. We've looked at what the visionary experiences are comprised of. Now is the time to create a hypothesis. And now I'm putting words into the mouths of Bryce and Alex and Cody. But I think the hypothesis, if we were to try to reduce it down, is that Joseph Smith ingested entheogens and administered them to others, which caused hallucinations they interpreted as religious visionary experiences. And so
I want to comment on that. That isn't correct. We're saying hallucinations has an extremely negative connotation, and that's not what we're saying at all. Not hallucinations that they interpreted as religious visionary experiences, but that they ingested entheogens, and this was the cause of the experiences, and there's no distinction between them.
And I think it's also reductive to say that it's all just about hallucinations. Hallucinations are just one part of the psychedelic or the entheogenic experience, and those can be auditory and visual and other sensory hallucinations, even taste and smell and touching. But the hallucinations are just one small piece of it. we are much more talking about the overall elevated experience, the emotional experience of it, as well as the way that it alters a person's psychology and commits them to lifelong faith in whatever context the visionary experience happened.
And also, just as a quick note, I'm sure as an anesthesiologist, you're aware there's dose variance, dose response. And you're speaking about entheogens as though you take entheogen and X happens. And there's quite a wide spectrum in there for like dose variance, dose response. So I just want to insert that.
I mean, depending on if you have a planned stopping point, Brian, we could pause here because we've got a lot of responses to your first few slides. But if you have a preset stopping point, then feel free to continue to that.
Actually, this is it. Okay. So go ahead.
All right. So that was the presentation, and thanks guys for interjecting here. So who would like to go first?
How do we want to do this? Do we want to have Brian bring his slides back up and we can respond to those points, or
Yeah, you could ask him, hey, can you pull up that slide? However you want to do it. Yep.
Bryce, Cody, or Bryce, do you want to start?
Sure. So I just want to very, very briefly speak to the methodology that we're using here, because I think there is a foundational misunderstanding of the way that history or historical studies are done and the way that the methodology of history works. History is a social science. It is not a test tube science. However, the cyclical nature that Brian showed with the testing of hypotheses, while there is overlap with the historical method, that is not the historical method because it is a social science. A big part of the historical method is, of course, source criticism. You are looking at the sources, you are understanding the context in which the sources are made, and you are dealing with those sources and incorporating sources into an entire corpus of information and knowledge. And we have, we live in an era of new Mormon history. As part of this new Mormon history is re-examination of sources and source criticism. And in order to do that, we need to determine the reliability of these sources. We need to determine the likelihood that they were stated in the proper context, the likelihood that they are later reminiscences, trusting the reliability of a source based on the amount of time that has passed since the event happened to when the event was recorded. There are a lot of there are a number of heuristics that we use in order to determine the reliability and the trustability of sources, and then that all contributes to creating argumentation. And the argumentation is where we actually build the historical models. Our historical model is that we see extreme visionary experiences that happen in early Mormonism that we do not see in other eras of Mormonism. So what factors contribute to the statistical anomaly of the visionary experiences, as noted by the consensus of Mormon historians, right? Alexander Baugh's article is just one among a litany of sources or of historians that discuss the visionary experiences in early Mormonism. So why do we see this spike of very odd experiences that drop off after a certain period of time? So in order to interrogate that statistical variance, we need to understand the other factors that may have contributed to it. And we point to naturalistic explanations, the use of entheogens and these ritualistic shamanistic practices by Joseph Smith and the early leaders of the church. That is all to say, history is not a test tube science, and we should not be approaching it as a test tube science. And it seems that, Brian, from the slide that you presented, that you are trying to make history a test tube science.
Well, why don't I wait to respond? Because this isn't just about history, Bryce, and you know this. This is about science. And so what I'm proposing is that we test the hypothesis, whether it's hallucinations or other psychoactive types of reports from the drug enthusiasts that are using these things. We want to compare those to the visionary experience descriptions that we have in the historical record. That's true. But we also have a whole group of science observations about what these drugs do and how you obtain the psychedelic experience. I guess I can't use the word hallucination, but how we get that effect from these chemical substances. And that's actually the next section. And I'm ready to move on to that. And I think I'll cover most of what you've said by the time we get through the third section. So rather than jump ahead, what you said about history is absolutely true, Bryce. I agree with everything. But there are, when it comes to trying to document the use of entheogens, I think we need to look at history as critically as you implied for these other things, and that's where I find there to be a deficit. But that's my third section. So however you guys want to proceed, but my next section is going to look at these drugs from a scientific standpoint.
So before we move on, I just want to make sure that Alex and Cody, if you have anything you want to say before we move on to the next section, I want to make sure you get your voices in here too.
Do we want to start with symptomology of these visions? Like, should we jump into that in the Kirtland Temple first before he moves on, or should we wait until the end?
If you want to, Alex, that's up to you. I can wait till the end personally.
Yeah, let's just do that. So
Okay.
I guess continue, Brian.
Okay, so we'll just continue here. Okay, so let's go on to the next section, Brian.
Okay, we're going to share my screen again. We're now going to talk about testing the hypothesis. And to do this scientifically, at least from my perspective, and I appreciate the comments from Bryce and Alex and Cody, it's very possible that I am not fully understanding their hypothesis. I thought I did. I've read that article several times, but that's fine. I mean, we want clarity here, and we want everybody to be on the same page. But my understanding is that we want to find an entheogen that can create, and hallucinations may not be the best word, but some kind of a psychoactive feeling or reaction within the person who's ingesting it that is similar to the reported religious visions, and I would add the Book of Mormon dictation and these kinds of things, but also one that could be administered to a large group surreptitiously. And what I did is I went through the article, and the pages are on the left-hand side, and I tried to identify the visions and then the entheogen that is supposed to have caused that. Now, a criticism I have, and they may push back on that, and that's fine, is that quite often there are visions that are not really described in great detail that are then attributed either just to an unidentified entheogen, or that they're identified to an entheogen, but it isn't really shown, like datura, claviceps, and we'll talk about those in a minute, that actually would create these kinds of effects. I don't think that these things are tied together very well as a cause and effect in the article. But now I'd like to talk about the 7 compounds that are talked about in the article. And I'm sorry, this is a very busy slide, but I'm going to refer back and forth to it. So you're going to get familiar with it. So this is very important because I want to talk about these chemicals individually and what we can say from science and from the non-scientific databases, because I've been amazed this last couple of weeks. I've been going online, and there are so many reports of people using these compounds that it's really not difficult to try to compare what they are saying to what the early Latter-day Saints were experiencing based on their descriptions. Now, the first drug that's mentioned, and we saw it mentioned as causing some things on my last slide, but claviceps purpurea is actually not a chemical at all. It grows on wheat and grains. You can see it here. These little stalks that are brown are actually chemical factories, and they create over 100 different chemicals. And if you take this, you don't know what you're going to get exactly. I mean, it has gynecological uses as an ergot, but it isn't always predictable. But it does change your sensorium if you ingest this over months and years, which people would do because it would be on rye or wheat. It's psychoactive. It makes people behave differently and feel differently. It's vasoactive in that it'll close off the arteries in your fingers, so your fingers fall off over time. I mean, this is really a remarkable little chemical factory here, but it really has no religious or recreational use, and I do not understand why this would be included here.
Point of clarification. Ergot is one of the leading substances that was potentially used in the Eleusinian mysteries in early Greece. So it does have both religious and recreational use.
I would also like to quickly interject that German midwives have been using ergot tinctures since the 14th century that we know of reliably, and they understood the off-label side effects of it because, you know, they had a dose spectrum they were working within, and they understood that if you give somebody a higher end of this dose on the dose spectrum, then they're going to experience visions. This was part of the literature for making these tinctures. So you can continue. I just didn't know if you knew that.
with all due respect, okay, this is not science to know exactly how much of this you're getting. And these individual things produce different chemicals in different amounts. Yes, ergot was known to use that, but it wasn't a predictable response. It usually could create abortion. That was a big use of it historically, and yet it wasn't science. And the point is, what you said is all, I'd agree with that. But
Science only has existed since like the 1800s as we understand it. And indigenous people across the globe have been using these substances for thousands of years reliably and have developed their own quote unquote science for dose, set, and setting for all of these things. So they've understood how to use datura without killing each other. They've understood how to use ergot in proper doses throughout history. So just because we can't narrow down and isolate the specific molecule 1,000 years ago and give that to someone and see exactly what that does, there's a broader scientific practice going on of, testing these across many different people in many different settings across history over and over and over again. So science is just this collection of anecdotal data, through random placebo-controlled trials, collection of anecdotes of how it affects a person. And so we have thousands and thousands of anecdotes of these things built up through history in a collective body of knowledge.
Bryce, you wanted to say something real quick too, and then we'll let Brian respond.
Yeah, I think it's just worth acknowledging, right? Like it's very convenient for us to go down to the local drugstore and pick up, cough medicine, right? That's tightly controlled, synthetic, oftentimes synthetic derivations of plant materials. But like our modern pharmacopoeia came from experimentation of all of our ancestors for literally thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, right? We have been drinking herbal teas probably started doing so about the same time that we harnessed fire and started boiling water, right? So like it's worth acknowledging that the scientific method of determining like what amount of specific molecules will cause this effect or this side effect or so on and so forth, like that is the clinical scientific method of modern pharmacology. It came from somewhere, right? We have been using and experimenting with all of the plants and herbs around us for as long as humans have been Homo sapiens and long before that.
Okay, so Cody wants to weigh in, and then Brian, why don't you respond?
I just have one quick side note to what Bryce was saying. If we look at some of the most respected ethnobotanists in the world, say Richard Evans Schultes, for example, who went to the Amazon and is responsible for hiding many of the pharmaceuticals we're using today. He referred to the indigenous peoples who were teaching him this knowledge as the real masters, as the real chemists. They just were using different language than we use today, even though they were using what he considered the scientific method. So,
okay, Brian, respond, and then we'll continue.
I appreciate what you're saying, and I don't know that.
And Brian, real quick, why don't you exit out of screen share? Just so that it's easier for our viewers that follow the conversation.
No, thanks, Steve, for reminding me. Sometimes I forget it's up there. I appreciate what you're saying. I'm not sure that I disagree with anything that you're saying, except that let's put this into context. You're saying Joseph Smith is using claviceps and ergot to predictably produce the kind of visions that we reviewed. I don't think that's defensible, but why don't we just move on? Okay, the problems with ergot is it's not one drug, and each preparation is going to be different because you're isolating different amounts of these, and each one of these is going to have different chemicals inside of it based upon the type of grain that it's growing on, its size, the time of year and season. And to say that this could have been systematized in any way enough to create mass well, I can't use the word hallucination anymore. Any kind of
you can use that word. I just wanted to clarify that we're not arguing that they were hallucinating.
Well, maybe I should just say psychedelics or something, but that's not what it does. This is toxic. It grows, you get it in your system over months and weeks and years, and then it has its effect. It isn't something Joseph would have introduced there. It would have made people sick if they took it long enough, and if they didn't take it long enough, it's not going to give the effects that would produce those kind of visionary experiences. That's my point. And I appreciate all the other great science and history that you presented. That's great. But this is something that just shouldn't have been included in the article. That's my position, because it doesn't get us where you want to be. Go ahead, Bryce.
I just want to acknowledge, right, the using various psychedelics over a long-term period of time, right? Like ergot, like part of ergot's like cultural history also involves its possible influence on like Saint Anthony's fire, as well as it possibly contributing to the visionary experiences that led to the Salem witch trials. So there's a concept of like using these things over a long period of time and it causing finger rot, causing the tips of your fingers to fall off, turn black, and fall off from long-term usage of this. And that's usually because it's a blight on the grains, and they're making bread with the blighted grains. That is poisonous. But there's the immediate use of it, the immediate dosage application of it, that you get the actual dose response for it that can cause the person to enter an altered state of consciousness. And one of the reasons why we focus on ergot is because it was so ubiquitous. It had medical applications, primarily as as an abortifacient, as well as helping expectant mothers or somebody to induce labor as well. But beyond that, like, it's also comprises the constituent chemicals that form acid, right? LSD, lysergic acid diethylmide. So that is taken from ergot, but it's worth acknowledging that those chemicals live in the fungus, and you can, when you take something that has that fungus in it, you are taking in all of those chemicals, and the psychedelic chemicals that we're referring to are part of that overall dose response that you're going to have.
Okay.
Also, specifically, ergot was most often applied in tinctures. So that is a way of systemizing it. You're taking a lot of different ergot grains that may have different chemical constituents within them, and you're homogenizing them within an alcoholic base, giving you a base level to then test its strength. So you can actually be quite accurate in dosage with very little equipment.
Well, let's keep it in context. I mean, is Joseph surreptitiously administering this to the Latter-day Saints to get the visions that are there? I get what you're saying. Although, Bryce, they're precursors to LSD. They're not the psychoactive drug LSD. I'm trying to just keep us back focused on you're trying to use this drug to explain those visionary experiences. I'm not seeing a connection. You're defending it as being common. You're talking about it in other contexts completely.
We're having to clarify your misunderstandings
talk about this. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Alex.
Yeah,
We're
Alex,
having to clarify your misunderstandings of this and of its use throughout history by saying that ergot has no religious use in your slide. That's completely against the history of it. And by saying it can't be systematized until, modern science, against the history of it. So we're trying to contextualize.
Actually, it was Albert Hofmann, the inventor of LSD, that put forward the hypothesis that you could make ergot beers and then use hot oil to float off the convulsive alkaloids, and it would make a safe hallucinogenic drink that was almost exactly LSD. So we
can go back to Joseph's stuff if you want. Like we listened to the first bit, but when you're blatantly giving misinformation about the drugs, we have to clarify that. And so that's why we've started interjecting, is because we've got to clarify this for the listener who might know nothing about these substances. So we can go and start talking about Kirtland Temple dedication, the symptomatology, if you want.
So let me just ask you a simple question. Do you believe that ergot would have caused any of the visionary experiences described by the Latter-day Saints?
I think we're saying it could have. It is one potential candidate. Because we are trying to rebuild this model, there is no way that we can conclusively say that any of these things were the thing being used. We are putting forward a bunch of potential candidates that should be further explored as entheogenic agents.
Okay, and one of my biggest criticisms is you can do this. And I think that, can you cite any historical evidence of somebody taking ergot and having a visionary experience like those that are described? And again, this is a visionary experience that comes and then goes away. Because with ergot, they don't go away. It accumulates, and the effects accumulate in the body over time, and you are stuck there. That's why the witches were witches. They didn't stop being witches at the end of the vision. Ergot does not do what these drugs would need to do to duplicate the visions. That's my point.
I
Okay,
feel like
Bryce?
I feel like we're all wanting to jump in because there's a considerable amount of misinformation in that material, and I instead of just tackling misinformation bullfacedly, I think we should also discuss that ergot is one of many constituent chemicals or many candidate entheogens, and we discuss a lot of different candidate entheogens because they're so ubiquitous. They are everywhere available. There are others that are much harder geographically to put near the Mormons during their early visionary period, and that would specifically toad secretions and the synthetic version or our chemical of it, 5-MeO-DMT, as well as peyote, William C. That's harder to get to Joseph Smith, but every other of the entheogenic candidates that we discussed, ergot, nightshades, fungus,
Amanita.
psilocybe, amanita, these are abundantly available, well documented in Joseph Smith's area, and importantly, we tap into a lot of the literature of occult practices and the ritualistic use of many of these substances in order to facilitate ministration with spirits, prophecy, celestial gifts, right? We cite those throughout our papers, all of our papers on this subject, because we are just citing the same books that D. Michael Quinn cited when he talked about and constructed the early Mormonism and the magic worldview. In those same tomes of occult science and philosophy are recipes for psychedelic substances. So yes, I think I agree with you so wholeheartedly, Brian. It is important to read it within the context of the time it is given.
Yeah, I don't know how to say this nicely, but I think most of what you're saying is a smokescreen. Now, I know that's a pejorative word, but why not just take all this research that you're doing and identify one entheogen that would do that? See, I
Because
don't
it
think any
wasn't
of them
just
do.
one.
Well, but okay, then identify several. Can you show me individuals who are taking these drugs and reporting the kind of experiences we find in the historical record? Because
I can read you one if you would like.
what is
Okay,
it? Yeah,
Cody.
sure, let's do it.
Cody, do you want to go ahead?
Steve, is that okay? This is going to be a really long podcast for you. I hope that's okay.
Well, I'm looking like we all have our own individual notes, and I know that I have 9 pages worth of notes. I know that Alex has 12 pages worth of notes. Like, we have a lot of sources to share just up to this point. Brian has you've kind of been dictating the course and the direction of the conversation. So I think it would be good for us to dig into the actual sources, and we may be getting lost in the weeds a little bit, and that may be hard for it may not be accessible to a lot of viewers. So we'll kind of hopefully reel back a little bit and discuss to try and make it a little more accessible, but just understand that there's a whole lot of information that is built into this conversation and a lot of history that all 4 of us have with each other and reading each other's material that we're working from, that the viewers themselves are not working from. So yeah, I think it would be good to spend a little bit of time with the actual sources.
And let me say, Alex, as you read this account, let's keep it into context. We want to compare what we have in the historical record from the Latter-day Saint visionaries, and we want to then take the drug and try to figure out how they would have gotten it into their systems and keep it real instead of just talking about diffuse. It's been out there for so long. We know Joseph had it. See, there's a leap of logic there. I'm trying to close that gap here. Let's try to have some granular.
If we want to talk about Joseph, whether or not he had.
Are you going to interrupt me, Alex? Let me finish, okay? I won't interrupt you. I promise. Okay. I just want a kind of a granular explanation that explains how this actually could have happened instead of this diffuse references to history and all this stuff. So here, now I'll be quiet and listen to you.
Well, if we want to talk about how Joseph had this stuff, we should start with
No,
the
talk
Smith
about the
family
vision.
and their herbal skills.
I told you I wouldn't interrupt. Sorry. But
Okay.
but
So
I thought
Alex,
you were gonna read it again.
are you going to do a screen share, Alex, with this quote?
Well, it depends. Are you looking for a historical source or a source that lines up exactly with Latter-day Saint visionary experiences?
Well, you said you had a quote. I just want to know, are you just going to read it off your screen, or
I was asking Brian.
Oh, okay.
What I found, Alex and Bryce and Cody, is that there is a breakdown in cause and effect. we have the visions. They're there, they're described, they're constant. They really are. And I outlined the characteristics. And then on the other side, we have this word entheogen, and it's never really defined as what the drug is. And then you show accounts of people having these things predictably, not just 1 out of 20, but you give this drug and then predictably. So Joseph would have known. See, Joseph Smith is supposed to have been taking this and giving it to others and knowing that they're going to have these positive visionary experiences. I'm trying to have you identify an entheogen that would do that predictably and give us some evidence. So Alex, maybe I misunderstood, but that's what I thought you were going to provide is an account of that. So,
Bryce, do you want to start?
Yeah. So, look, this is kind of difficult to deal with, right? Because Brian, you are looking for like one piece of evidence where the language from a 19th century psychonaut is exactly the same language that Joseph Smith was using. And this comes to just a fundamental breakdown of understanding how psychedelic experiences work, and the sensations that are attendant with having the elevated and altered states of consciousness. So if you want to talk about the experiences of early Mormons, we can talk about the symptomology, that what they are describing is similar to datura toxicology or the toxicology of ergot. If you're wanting to hear 19th century sources that are contemporary with Joseph Smith of their individual experiences, of their deleterious effects that are caused, the auditory and visual hallucinations that are attendant with these, we have those quotes as well. We can quote them from botanical journals and Thomsonian vegetable medicine that was popular at the time, or we can quote from the occult books and sources from that Joseph Smith likely used, from Francis Barrett to Henry Cornelius Agrippa. We can quote any of these sources. Like we are not starved for this. So Brian, what exactly are you wanting to see the exact parallel for here?
Well, I'm trying to look at it from Joseph Smith's view. See, the theory is that Joseph Smith wanted to give these people visions so they follow him or agree with him or something. And so he must have found some chemical, some entheogen that he was taking for himself, that he was giving to others without them knowing. And I'm trying to make that real. It's a reality test to all this data that you're referring to here. And I'm very impressed. You've done a lot of good research there. But how would Joseph have identified this?
All right. Which
one would he have chosen? Which one would you choose if you were there and you wanted to do this thing that Joseph Smith is supposed to have done? What would be the chemical?
Let's start there. I think this is a really important concept, is the access of Joseph to this information, right? We're talking about expertise in working with herbal vegetable materials, right? And fungus as well. How did Joseph have access to this information? In the paper, The Entheogenic Origins of Mormonism, The Working Hypothesis, we focus heavily on Lumen Walters, who was a magic mentor of Joseph Smith, who was an herbal physician, who was noted as a clairvoyant, who was, an eccentric root and herb doctor. But we don't need to even look outside of the Smith family to talk about people who were close to Joseph Smith, who had extensive knowledge of vegetables, of herbs, and of brewing. And Alex has done a lot of really good work with the Mack family and their exposure and experience with brewing. And of course, I know that Cody has a lot of material prepared on intemperance and the drunkenness, and how the drunkenness that we understand today that's post-prohibition is different than the drunkenness from the early 19th century. So I just want to send it over to Alex first and then to Cody to talk about alcohol in the 19th century.
So Lucy Mack had, Joseph's mother had extensive bar experience. Her family grew up. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Brian, unmute yourself, Brian. You want to say something?
I appreciate you've prepared all this stuff, but what I'm trying to find is one chemical that would create those visions. And we're going way out into the weeds from my perspective, unless you're saying it's ethanol, because you're talking about intoxication from alcohol. again, a
You want to
cause
know
and
how
effect
the
is-
Smiths? Sorry.
Well, and let me just say, Bryce, you've been reading too much of Quinn. There is no evidence that Joseph Smith ever met Luman Walters. And
All
it's
right.
okay.
Brian,
So
Brian, hang on. Let's just reel it back a little bit, right? So it's clear that one of your primary concerns is Joseph Smith's access to this information and herbal expertise. Let's deal with that right now. Then we can move on to the specific chemicals and intemperance and everything else.
Cody, you wanted to say something?
I would like to just quickly say that Brian is, I think, intentionally misleading the conversation because there is no one entheogen that is going to be the answer for you. We have to look at this in the context of a 19th century worldview. You don't have access to one plant all year long. That's just impossible. People in order to anyone who is a practitioner of this had several plants they were working with. And in most of the books of magic we can cite from, if you'd like to, they are mentioning a dozen plants or more that you could be working with and how to apply them in a fairly reliable sense. So I just want to reiterate, and I can go down every single one of these. In fact, like in my book that I wrote, I cover acacia, amanita, belladonna, cannabis, coffee, datura, ergot, ephedra, frankincense, hemlock, henbane, mandrake, mimosa, nutmeg, opium, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, tobacco, wild lettuce, and wormwood, all of which were used in combinations at times. There was not like one potion with just ergot in it all the time. Most of the time, there was a bunch of things in the potion you were taking, and the potion was most of the time an alcoholic tincture. So we have to, like, you're taking this out of historical context by wanting one answer that we're like, that's not what we're saying. And we have to give you many answers for it to make contextual sense to what Joseph would have understood it as.
Hey, Brian, turn your microphone on, Brian.
I appreciate what you said, because that's actually my point. That whatever the entheogen is that you think he did, it had to be predictable in every case. And I was going to get to this, I don't know how long this is going to be. There are bad trips with all of these entheogens, and yet there are no bad trips reported. They're always positive. They're very similar. Okay. There's light, there's positive. There's no entheogen in all of those that you've just mentioned that will predictably do that. Sorry,
okay,
Steve.
So Brian, I just want to say one thing, because what I found was interesting was when you were describing how like there were no instances of like darkness or all these kind of things. Then I'm remembering Joseph Smith's description of the first vision, where he said he was dealing with these dark forces. It sounded like, as you were describing that, I was thinking, boy, that sure sounds a lot like Joseph Smith describing the first vision.
Or the first miracle of the church with Newell Knight.
With the demonic possession.
Or the June 1831 conference where people are somersaulting, where Lyman White's tongue is bound, his pupils are dilated, he's contorted, just because after the fact they were understood to be faith promoting doesn't mean that during they weren't hard. Like Joseph explicitly talks about in the 1831 conference, like they had to experience the devil, and the devil could be equated with the physiological symptoms, the negative physiological symptoms of psychedelic substances. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves because you still haven't let us put together a case that, the Smith family was intimately familiar with a lot of these.
And no, I don't dispute that. Okay, I didn't raise my hand. Sorry, Cody, go ahead.
I think we should be focusing more on the terms dose, set, and setting. Dose can be a number of different plants at a number of different dosage ranges, but understanding those doses is important. Set mainly being the fact that these things were taking place in a church, and they were being, like, the setting was conducive for a religious ecstatic experience. And these things happen on a kind of a predictability scale. So let's say you take a drug and you have a 50-50 chance of it being a good or bad chance. But let's say your set is a church and you want to have a religious experience. That's set and setting. Your set is your mindset. Setting is the place you're taking it in. So when you take it in a church, let's say that predictability of 50-50 now goes to 70-30, and you have a 70% chance of having a totally positive experience. Now you go dose set and setting, now you have a 90% chance of having a successful religious experience that is positive. And we're approaching pharmaceutical range. And if you'd like, I can go into the scientific research to back this up if you'd like.
So just real quick before we get started, because I don't know how much longer I have to continue this conversation. So I'm almost thinking we might want to break this into maybe come back and address some of this stuff. But real quick, I want to make it real clear here that I'm a person who was raised in the charismatic Pentecostal world, and I personally have spoken in tongues. I'm just bringing just my personal experience to the table here. I find this hypothesis to be truly fascinating, whether it's a first century Christian context or early Mormon context. It's a naturalistic explanation that I think it's worth looking into. But I will say that I've been in Pentecostal services where there was no spiking of anything going on, and I know that I wasn't exposed to anything, but it still had a charismatic experience. I've also been in a Bickertonite church service where literally in many of the services I've been to, somebody say, I saw an angel hovering over brother so-and-so while we're doing this prayer, or while they're saying this thing. So I find it fascinating that my personal experiences have not required any of this stuff, but I can see both being true at the same time as well. So I just want to kind of bring that to the table as well. And I also want to go to Latter-day Saints. I want to say, look, a lot of you get a little upset that we're kind of delving into some of these topics. I just want to let you know that, if you're not a believer and you don't believe in the supernatural, we also have to look at it from a scientific perspective, a naturalistic explanation, which I think it's a valid way to look at it. If there is no supernatural, there's no angels, then how do these things happen? So I think it's a legitimate question to ask. So I'm sorry, I didn't want to get on my the pulpit there, but I just wanted to kind of interject there because I don't want people thinking one thing or another. Whatever, I'm blabbering now. But Brian, did you want to say something?
Well, again, I don't believe there is any evidence that you've referred to that would allow us to think that there was one drug Joseph could have chosen that would have caused all these positive things. Now, you mentioned those negative things, but bad trips don't go that way. You don't have a bad trip
I've
for a
had
few
them
minutes and then you
with
have
those
good
exact
ones.
same. They do.
Have you taken
but that's not my
psychedelics,
point.
Brian?
What's that?
What is your experiential knowledge of this? Have you taken psychedelics?
No, I wouldn't do that. The point is that you guys are describing this scenario for Joseph that is so far fetched, but you said, well, it could happen, it could happen, it could happen, but you can't reproduce it. You can't take any of the entheogens and give them to a group of 20 or a group of 100 and expect them to have the same kind of reports that we're having here.
Actually,
it's happened.
I have a prepared statement, and we can end there if it's not, but I think this addresses what you're talking about perfectly.
Okay.
And it's actually a group of 20 people. If you want, since you said 20 people, I can produce that for you if you'd like.
Okay, so Cody, why don't you read that off real quick? I have to tell you, I'm suffering from tinnitus and the lawnmowers are mowing outside and it's kind of getting to me. So if I have to step away a little bit, I want you to, I'm going to read that statement. I'm going to have to step out just for a minute while the lawnmower is going by, and then you can share. So the floor is yours, Cody.
So I'm going to, in Brian's paper, he cited a checklist for visionary religious experiences that was put forward by Walter Pank. And Brian concludes his section with the kind of baseless assumption he keeps mentioning is that, quote, characteristics and other details reported in the psychedelic trips are compared to the early Latter-day Saint visionaries' descriptions. Stark contrasts are apparent. Overall, the hallucinations from entheogens seem qualitatively different in significant ways. Would you say that's still accurate of your position, Brian?
Well, I think that, okay, go ahead. I think I know what you're going to say. Let me respond after you get done.
Okay, so I'm going to bring up the miracle at Marsh Chapel, otherwise known as the Good Friday experiment, which took place at Harvard Divinity School in 1962. Ironically, the experiment was designed and run by the theology graduate Walter Pank, who used the same checklist cited by Brian to evaluate the experiences of the Good Friday participants. And he was seeking a reliable catalyst for devoted theology students wishing to have their own religious experience. Pank was attempting to evaluate the merits of psilocybin in particular as an entheogenic substance. So he took 20 volunteers from Harvard Divinity School who were divided into two test groups. The control group was given a hefty dose of niacin as an active placebo, which mimics the onset symptoms of psilocybin. The second group was given 30 milligrams of psilocybin. During the observations, a sermon by Reverend Howard Thurman was played, and the participants were encouraged to pray and sing hymns as they wished. The participants spent their time surrounded by striking stained glass depictions of Christian iconography, while the Thurman sermon was fed through the church's sound system. Other than their previous interest in theology as a field of study, the volunteers were not particularly primed psychologically in regard to what they could expect to happen. Renowned comparative religious scholar Houston Smith, and this might actually address what Steve was saying earlier, was a participant of the experiment. And he later said of the miracle at Marsh Chapel, quote, "The experiment was powerful for me, and it left a permanent mark on my experienced worldview. For as long as I can remember, I have experienced God, and I have experienced his presence both within the world and when the world was transcendently eclipsed." He's saying he knows what a religious experience is. But until the Good Friday experiment, I had had no direct personal encounter with God of the sort that the Bhakti Yogas, Pentecostals, and born-again Christians described. The Good Friday experiment changed that. So out of 10 participants who were given the psilocybin, all 10 of them had a visionary religious experience. And just to reiterate how profound this experience is for people who even know what to expect, several years after the Good Friday experiment, Dr. William Richards described Walter Pank's very enthusiastic first LSD session when he said, quote, "His ecstatic shouts still rang in my ears." And this is Walter Pank speaking. "Oh, I never could have imagined. Wow, fantastic. Man, this is great. I never would have thought. Joy, blessing, tenderness. Oh, Bill, this is great." And that's the end of the quote. As a theology student of Harvard Divinity School, having directed the observations on Good Friday, it is essential to note here just how unexpectedly profound the LSD sessions proved to be for Pank personally. Now, 25 years after the Good Friday experiment, Dr. Rick Doblin followed up with the experiment's participants and found that they had still rated the experience as one of the most significant and meaningful spiritual moments of their lives. Doblin reported, quote, "Experimental subjects wrote that the experience helped them to resolve their career decisions, recognize the arbitrariness of ego boundaries, increase their depth of faith, increase the appreciation of eternal life, deepen their sense of meaning of Christ, and heighten their sense of joy and beauty. No positive persisting changes were reported by the control group in the open-ended session of the follow-up questionnaire. The long-term follow-up interviews can cast considerable doubt on the assertion that mystical experiences catalyzed by drugs are in any way inferior to non-drug mystical experiences in both their immediate content and long-term positive effects." I promise I'm almost done. Years later, in 2006, researchers at Johns Hopkins redesigned the Good Friday experiment under much stricter conditions in a clinical setting. They similarly concluded that psilocybin does indeed initiate deeply profound and positive spiritual changes lasting at least 14 months after the session when administered under appropriate group conditions. Now, Pank's checklist, which I'm just going to go over real quick: unity, objectivity and reality, transcendence of time and space, sense of sacredness, deeply felt positive mood, paradoxicality, alleged ineffability, transiency, and positive changes in attitude and behavior. Despite Brian's baseless assertions otherwise, Pank's checklist does indeed appear to be qualitatively comparable with the early Mormons' reports of visionary experiences, most notably the June 1831 conference, the School of the Prophets, and the Kirtland Temple dedication. I'm done. That's all I needed to say.
Okay,
Steve-
so thank you. First of all, that was interesting. I've never heard that before, so it was very interesting. And I've got these lawnmowers, and it's kind of driving me nuts, to be honest with you guys. So I want to, Brian, maybe to follow up, and then I think we need to revisit this conversation. There's outside circumstances that are affecting me at this moment, but Brian, did you want to say something?
Well, I'd like to share 2 slides
Okay.
and interject a little reality, because Cody, you're saying Joseph was able to duplicate this study in those settings. Okay, the thing that we need to remember is Joseph didn't have easy access to psilocybin. If we look at the chart, and I'm not able to present most of the stuff that I want to. I worried this might happen, that we would just get bogged down with the detail. But look at the dosing for this mushroom. For Joseph to get 20 people high on psilocybin, he's going to have harvested hundreds of mushrooms. He's got to get these people to eat the mushrooms in a way that they don't know.
You're miscategorizing what I'm saying once again, actually. You asked for one specific
You interrupted
entheogen
me. Can I finish? Can I finish? Let me finish,
Sure.
Cody. Okay. You talked about psilocybin as causing this religious experience that duplicates what the early saints experienced. For them to get that much psilocybin in their system, they would have each needed to consume 5 to 15 of these mushrooms without knowing it. You couldn't have gotten it into the wine. Okay, you're shaking your head. No. So how did the psilocybin get into the Latter-day Saints?
So when you add psilocybin to wine, you end up decarboxylating it into a stronger psychoactive substance called psilocin. And if you're using amanitas, you do the same thing with muscimol, decarboxylates into ibotenic acid, which is again 4 to 5 times more hallucinogenically active. So your dosage chart is just inaccurate and not accounting for carrier methods like wine. So
okay, so Joseph Smith is taking these mushrooms and he's taking out the psychoactive compound psilocybin, and then he's introducing it into the wine, or he's introducing it into the bread, and nobody knows this is happening. And honestly, if you study the accounts, you do have to eat about 10 of these mushrooms to get the effect. You're shaking your head no, but that's repeated over and over. That's why you grow your own mushrooms. And let me just end with one more slide. I see that we're getting to the end here. I'm going to have to stop sharing and just buzz down, because you've mentioned Quinn several times. And I just want to end with this slide because there really is, I think, a real problem with this theory. But here we go. Thank you for letting me do this. Everybody's being very patient and kind. But this is what Mike had to say. I sent the article to Mike. He's mentioned many times in the article. He told me, I have never written or spoken even privately in favor of their speculation. You may quote me. So here's somebody who knows all about the magic. He's read your article. He's not agreeing, and I'm not agreeing. And I think that if we can get into the details, we'll see that you found this very extreme possibility that it could, but you can't get specific. And that's where the theory breaks down. It can't be tested. It can't be replicated in a way that you would have the majority or all have this experience without having bad trips. So anyway, Steve, where do you want to go from here? We've been talking for an hour and a half or so.
Okay, so
we should be able to respond to that.
Yeah, real quick. Let's close out the screen and then.
Bryce.
Okay, so the lawnmowers are just driving me crazy, but I want you, Alex, the opportunity, or you guys, to respond to what Brian had just said, and then I'd like for us to wrap up this session. And I apologize, but there's circumstances beyond my control in this situation. I just want everybody that we can revisit this and make sure that we can cover these, the totality of this as well. So do your response, and then again, thank you guys for your patience on this, and then we'll have to wrap it up today. So who would like to go? You go. I want to go, Alex or Bryce, or who wants to go first?
Yeah, so I just want to take great umbrage with the assertions that the theory cannot be tested and it cannot be replicated. Yes, and I can speak from my own personal experience. Since publishing extensively and presenting on this topic, I've had a number of individuals approach me and say, hey, I was skeptical of this until my first trip, and then I believed it. That has happened many, many times. I personally had a conversation with D. Michael Quinn at Sunstone in Short Creek, I believe it's 2018, concerning this topic. And it was a very cordial, a very brief conversation. And D. Michael Quinn was a resolute conservative academic. He never spoke to anything that he did not have a citation for. And anyone who knows D. Michael Quinn, knew D. Michael Quinn, I'm sorry, knows that is just how he approached the world. So when we had a conversation about this over lunch one day, he said, yes, it was interesting. It was thought-provoking that he had never considered it. And then our conversation moved on from that time. And I think it's very indicative that, D. Michael Quinn was a believing Mormon his entire life. Yes, he was excommunicated and remained a faithful Mormon. and that there are cultural blinders, and these cultural blinders are results of both sectarian prohibitions on these things as well as legal prohibitions on psychedelics, and those obviously come out of cultural biases that exist that have long predated any legal prohibitions on any of these substances. So that's all to say that D. Michael Quinn has never spoken in favor publicly or privately of this speculation because, frankly, D. Michael Quinn had never studied it. He never knew anything about psychedelics, it appears. And Brian, it appears that in a similar vein, that the cultural and sectarian blinders that are put in place have made it so that there is an experiential barrier here that we are struggling, where clearly all of us are struggling to communicate over this experiential barrier. And so that is all to say that, yeah, you cannot test this in the sense that you cannot put the historical model in a test tube, run it through a process, and then conclude as a result of what comes out of that process that this 100% did happen, because that's just not how history works. What we are saying is that there are statistical anomalies in the visionary experiences by the early Mormons, and that those experiences dropped off at a later time. And we want to understand what contributed to those factors. And as the method of history works, we do not have access to divine agents as explanatory power. Therefore, we must seek rationalistic explanations. And those rational explanations need to be rooted in what is contextual and contemporary with early Mormonism. Therefore, we are forced to look to the world of the magic worldview and the occult folklore of the time that birthed the mind of Joseph Smith, the cultural milieu, and understand the factors that contributed to that. One of the factors that contributed to the occult and magic mindset was the usage of psychedelics. We document this extensively, and we believe that Joseph Smith's experience with using occult practices, seer stones and whatnot, he clearly learned also part of that whole zeitgeist of information and expertise includes psychedelics, and that this was one of the toolkits used by magicians, by ceremonial magicians, in order to achieve altered states of consciousness, in order to conduce to prophesying, in order to provide soothsaying, in order for them to access clairvoyant powers and what they termed as celestial gifts. I can cite all of these myself here, but we don't have time for that, so I just encourage people to read about this because we have extensively cited all of these things. And to Brian saying that all of these experiences can't be replicated, that's just, I don't know how else to say that, but that is just misinformed, and it is just wrong. These experiences are replicated by individuals all day, every day. And there are numerous people who I'm familiar with, people who I consider friends, who are also working to recreate the endowment in the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremonies, including psychedelics, in order to achieve and emulate the spiritualism that they believe Joseph Smith was able to create for the early Mormons. And I say that like you are chasing something that is in your heritage, and that is a worthwhile endeavor. And I wish you the best of luck to all of those individuals who have talked to me about this. So all that is to say that it can be tested to the extent that a historical model can be tested. That is not a test tube hard science. And it can be replicated and is replicated every single day. So there's so much more to this. And unfortunately, obviously, there is an experiential barrier that we are having a very difficult time communicating across.
Okay, so I just want to tell you that the lawnmowers they're buzzing around. And so I don't know if I can continue this just because of the circumstances, but I want to say that this is a fascinating conversation because, it is interesting because, I've experienced supernatural things without these, and so there's a, I just find it really fascinating to think that, but we also know that psychoactive substances are merely just, they're just opening up something that already exists in the human brain. And so we know that you don't necessarily need substances to activate these things. It could be fasting, it could be repetitive prayer, it could be music. It could also bring on these kind of things as well. So it begs the question that, even that the idea of using psychoactive things does not obviate doesn't mean that there isn't a God. that it could arguably that process of opening something up in your mind is actually the way that one does communicate to the divine, and that these psychoactive substances can be like a shortcut to that, which I find to be an interesting way of looking at it. I'm fascinated by the topic. Brian, I want to thank you for coming on today. I know this was, I hope I know you said you were fine with three on one, and and so I hope that you feel that you were treated fairly, and I hope, guys, and again, I apologize just for the circumstances that are happening here, but I want us to come back and maybe continue this conversation. And yes, okay. So Brian, real quick, and then we'll have everybody wrap up at the end of the closing statement. Brian, did you want to have anything to say before we wrap this up?
You know, I didn't get to present even a third of the material that I had wanted to present. And I still don't think we have an actual granular explanation of how Joseph did it, and with any kind of historical support. And it's all hypothetical, it's speculative, and there are drugs that can give you a religious experience, but not 100% of the time. So, you know, you say it's happening every day, not to groups, not to the percentage that we're saying. You're nodding your head. But for Joseph to gain the expertise that allowed those experiments to happen, I disagree. But that would have been strong to put in your article. I don't want to extend this discussion. Steve, you've been very gracious to let me come on. I'm happy to come back. I'd love to be able to present my material without the interruption. I think it would help. I can maybe qualify some of the concerns and the arguments, because we want to get down to that granular explanation. Joseph is back there doing it, and nobody mentions it. Nobody talks about him doing it. He's just so sneaky. I want to discuss that part of the theory historically, because it has value, I think.
Okay. So again, this is just really the opening salvo on this whole conversation. I really feel that we just started unpacking here, and there's so much here that you all want to bring up to the conversation. Just real quick, there is a movie that's going to be debuting soon that is the basis of that. If somebody wants to talk about that, and then any of you want to talk about anything, any future projects or stuff that you want to talk about, Cody, did you want to talk about the movie, where it's going to be shown, and the dates real quick?
Yeah, I'll briefly plug that, and then we can let you get out of here since you're suffering through this. The showings for the documentary EntheoMagus, it's a short format, 40-minute documentary that covers this topic. Does not get nearly into it as is required for a conversation like this, but is a nice introductory documentary to the subject. We're doing showings in Salt Lake City, April 27th, 28th, and 29th. You can find free tickets at searstonedproductions.com. That's searstonedproductions.com. We also have a showing in Portland, Oregon on May 11th at 6 p.m. You can also get tickets through the same site. And that's about it. Thanks very much, Steve.
Thanks, Cody. Bryce?
I will just add into that. There will be Q&A sessions at the end of those screenings. Obviously, it's a series of screenings over a span of 2 days, probably 3 days at this point. So if you all do have questions, primarily if you have concerns and criticisms of the theory overall, we would love to have you come out during one of those screenings to vocalize those concerns and criticisms to the panel of the people who made the documentary. So we just encourage people to attend the showings and to go to searstonedproductions.com for more information on that. And of course, if you want to begin to scratch the surface, Brian, we resonate with that. We only got to present a tiny portion of what we brought here today. Obviously, it's a massive topic. All of us have done extensive media on this. I myself have covered this on my podcast, Naked Mormonism and Glassbox, a number of times. Has spent many hours on this, including reading the actual academic paper from the Journal of Psychedelic Studies into the podcast. So that's in episodes 185, I believe. So that is all to say that if you want to begin to access this information, it's very dense. There's a lot to discuss. And obviously, when there's a disagreement, that's going to engender a lot more conversation that is not specifically about the sources. So there's just so much material to access here. And we encourage people to begin to scratch the surface, and that the documentary is a great place to begin to be introduced to the subject.
Okay, thanks, Bryce. And Alex, was there anything you wanted to say?
No, thanks for having us on, Steve.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for your patience today. I know this was an interesting conversation, and yes, maybe some of you are frustrated or whatever, but I think it's important that, look, we had a conversation today, and I think it's important that we all come to the table and be able to have conversations with each other, people who are diametrically opposed to each other, and many ideologically or theologically or whatever. It's important that we have these conversations, and sometimes they're going to be a little messy too, but that's okay. That's okay. It's fine. It's good. I think it's good for our audience to see the evolution of how these conversations develop. And it's not always going to be a neat little thing, you know, it's going to be a little messy and sloppy, but that's the actual real human experience, lived experience of how we grapple with different ideas. And I think it's important that everybody experiences that process. So I'd like to hear in the comments about so far what we've covered. It's interesting. It's very controversial. There's a lot of things to talk about, and I'd like to hear about your experiences. One, have you experienced a Pentecostal experience or charismatic experience? Have you spoken in tongues? Did you do it? Have you had spiritual experiences while you have done psychoactive substances? Maybe share that as well. And then just tell us, hey, where you weigh on this? Has this opened your eyes on this? Is this an interesting topic to you? I'm just fascinated by it in and of itself. We're talking about Mormon history, and whenever we're talking about early Mormon history in particular, I'm on board. So leave your comments, and then of course we'll have links in the description to the things that we talked about. We also want to thank you, those of you who are financially supporting the channel. We have links in the description where you can financially support the channel. Of course, don't forget our merch store, MormonBookReviews.com. And remember, the most important thing is this: all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.